The auctioneer's voice rang out across the dusty square of Redemption, Texas, in the sweltering summer of 1878, calling out a number so low that even the mules tethered to the hitching post down the street seemed worth more. And that was the moment Patrick Slater's jaw set like iron, and his blue eyes went cold as a winter creek. The town of Redemption sat in the crook of the Brazos River country, a sprawling collection of sun-bleached clapboard buildings and rutted streets that smelled of cattle and wood smoke, and the particular desperation of people trying to carve a life from unforgiving land. It was a place where a man's word was his bond, where the church bell rang on Sunday mornings and the saloon piano played every other night of the week, and where justice sometimes wore a badge and sometimes rode in on horseback, and sometimes simply never showed up at all. It was August, and the heat pressed down on everything like a heavy wool blanket, and nobody in Redemption that afternoon would have expected the day to go the way it did. Patrick Slater had ridden into town that morning with no particular business, beyond resupplying at the general store, and settling a small debt, with a man named Holloway who ran the feed and grain operation on the eastern edge of Main Street. Patrick was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened face that came from years of working cattle across the open range of West Texas. He wore a battered hat, a canvas duster even in the heat, and a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip that he carried more out of practical necessity than any love of trouble. He was a foreman on the Double Creek Ranch some 12 miles south of town, a position he had earned through 7 years of honest, back-breaking work, and he had a reputation among the ranchers and trail bosses of the county as a fair man, a hard worker, and someone you could trust to do what he said he would do. He had not planned to be anywhere near the square that afternoon. He had finished his business at the general store, loaded his saddlebags, tied them to his horse, a steady, dark brown quarter horse named Roan on account of the little rust-colored patch behind his left ear, and had been making his way back toward the hitching rail on the far end of Main Street when the crowd noise drew him around the corner and stopped him dead. There were perhaps 40 people gathered in front of the old Hadley building, which served variously as a meeting hall, a court, and whatever else the town needed it to be on a given day. A wooden platform had been erected out front, the kind used for announcements and the occasional public spectacle, and standing on it was a heavy-set man in a brown suit that had seen better decades. His name was Gerald Coombe, and he was what passed for a broker of human misfortune in that corner of Texas, not a slave trader, because that era had ended 13 years prior and good riddance to it, but a man who dealt in debts and contracts and the fine print that trapped people who had no one to speak for them. Patrick pushed through the edge of the crowd, not sure what he was looking at, and then he saw her and everything else fell away. Fannie Morgan stood on that platform with her hands folded in front of her, and her chin lifted at an angle that told anyone paying attention that she had made the decision to die before she would let any of these people see her broken. She was 23 years old, with dark chestnut hair that had come loose from its pins in the heat, and was curling slightly at her temples, and dark eyes that swept the crowd with a kind of controlled fury she was working very hard to keep contained. She was not a large woman. She stood perhaps 5 feet and 4 inches. But she had the bearing of someone who had taken several hard blows from life already and was still standing, which Patrick recognized immediately because he had seen that particular posture before in people who had been worn down but not worn out. She was dressed in a plain cotton dress of faded blue, road-worn and travel-dusty, with a small cloth bag sitting at her feet that appeared to contain everything she owned in the world. There was a bruise on her left cheekbone, faded to yellow-green, that told its own story about how she had come to be standing on that platform. Gerald Coombe was speaking in the practiced drone of a man who had done this before and found it entirely unremarkable. He was explaining, for the benefit of the crowd, that Miss Fannie Morgan was being offered under the terms of an indenture contract, not slavery. He was very careful to say, Not anything like that. Just a work contract, legal and binding, entered into by her late father's estate to settle outstanding debts of considerable size. Whoever purchased the contract would have Miss Morgan's services as a housekeeper, a cook, a ranch hand, whatever the buyer required for a period of 3 years, after which the debt would be considered satisfied and she would be free to go wherever she pleased. Patrick watched the faces in the crowd as Coombe talked. He saw the usual collection of town merchants and ranchers and drifters. He saw a man named Bertram Sully standing near the front, a rancher from north of town with a reputation for working his hands into the ground, and a personal character that made most decent people keep their distance. He saw 2 or 3 other men he recognized as hard cases, men who would not treat a woman under their roof as anything other than property regardless of what the legal paperwork said. He felt something tighten in his chest, something that had nothing to do with the heat and everything to do with the look on Fannie Morgan's face and the bruise on her cheekbone and the little cloth bag at her feet. Coombe opened the bidding at $8. $8. Patrick owned a saddle worth more than that. A decent mule in redemption went for $15 to $25 depending on its age and temperament. A good mule, the kind that could work a farm for years, went for $30 or more. And Gerald Coombe was opening the bidding on 3 years of a woman's life at $8, as if she were something he had found discarded behind the livery stable. The bidding moved sluggishly upward. Bertram Sully called out $10 in the flat, proprietary tone of a man who expected to win. A couple of other men threw out figures without much conviction. The crowd shuffled and muttered. Patrick stood at the back and felt the tightening in his chest become something sharp and clarifying, the way the air sometimes feels just before a storm breaks. He had $22 in his pocket. It was most of what he had saved that month, money he had been planning to put toward a saddle repair and a new set of winter boots before the cold season came. He did not think about any of that for more than about half a second. Sully pushed his bid to $12 with the smug satisfaction of a man who could see the bidding winding down, and Coombe lifted his gavel and began to intone the closing sequence, going once, going twice, and something in Fannie Morgan's expression in that moment, some tiny fracture in that carefully maintained composure, some almost imperceptible flicker of despair in those dark eyes as she looked out at the crowd and understood what was about to happen to her, was the thing that made Patrick Slater open his mouth. $15, he said, loud enough that the whole square heard it. Every head turned. Coombe's gavel paused. Sully looked around with the expression of a man who has just been interrupted in the middle of a transaction he considered already complete. Fannie Morgan's eyes found Patrick at the back of the crowd, and he saw something move through her face. Not hope exactly, not yet, but a kind of arrested attention, the way a person looks when something unexpected has happened and they are not sure yet whether to believe it. Sully's jaw tightened. He looked Patrick up and down with the calculation of a man deciding whether someone was worth the trouble of a confrontation, and apparently decided he was not. 16, Sully said. 18, Patrick said without hesitation. A murmur ran through the crowd. Coombe's gavel was suspended in midair, his eyes moving between the 2 bidders with the alert interest of a man watching money multiply. Sully turned to look at Patrick properly now, sizing him up, and apparently concluded that the man in the canvas duster at the back was serious about this. 20, Sully said, with a note of irritation that suggested he was not accustomed to being challenged. Patrick had exactly $22. He thought about Fannie Morgan's face. He thought about the bruise on her cheekbone. He thought about the little cloth bag at her feet. 22, he said. The silence that followed had a quality to it. Sully stared at Patrick. The crowd waited. Coombe held his breath. On the platform, Fannie Morgan had gone very still. Sully made a sound that was half a laugh and half a dismissal, turned away, and said nothing more. Perhaps the sum was not worth the conflict to him. Perhaps he could find a cheaper housekeeper without the complication. Either way, he stepped back and was done. Coombe brought his gavel down with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet square. "Sold," he said. $22 to the gentleman in the back." Patrick moved through the crowd toward the platform. And as he did, he was already thinking very hard about what on earth he was going to do next, because he had just spent essentially all the money he had on a contract for a woman he had never met, and he had no clear plan beyond the certainty that she was not going to spend 3 years in Bertram Sully's house, with that bruise on her face going unexplained. He paid Coombe the $22 in coin, which left him with exactly 63 cents to his name, signed the contract papers that Coombe produced from a leather satchel with the officious manner of a man who considered paperwork the highest calling, and then turned to face Fannie Morgan, who had stepped down from the platform and was standing in front of him with her cloth bag in her hands, and those dark eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not entirely read. He took off his hat. It was an automatic gesture, something his mother had drilled into him so deep it had become instinct. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Patrick Slater. I ride foreman for the Double Creek Ranch south of town. I want you to know that the contract I just signed doesn't mean what that man up there made it sound like. You're not my property. You're a free person, and what happens next is up to you." Fannie looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the crowd was dispersing, the spectacle finished, people moving on to the next business of their day with the ease of people who had already made their peace with watching something like this happen without intervening. Fannie watched them go with a look that took note of all of it, filed it away, and then returned its full attention to Patrick. "What does that mean, exactly?" she asked. Her voice was steady and low, and there was a directness to it that matched her eyes. "What does it mean that it's up to me?" "It means you can walk away right now if you want to," Patrick said. "I'll tear up the contract. Nobody can stop you." "They can," she said simply. "Legally they can. Coombe would just sell the contract to someone else." "Then I'll burn the contract," Patrick said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, like sunlight moving behind cloud cover. "You paid $22 for a piece of paper you're going to burn." "I paid $22 so Bertram Sully didn't get it," Patrick said, "which I would do again for the same price." He paused. "And I want you to know, I want to say this clearly so there's no misunderstanding. That man up there said $12 and was about to close the bidding. I'm standing here looking at you and I'm thinking that price was an insult to you. That's not what it was supposed to mean. What I mean is," he stopped, because he was not a man who made speeches and could feel himself getting tangled in the words. He started again. "What I mean to say is that $22 is an insult too. It's an insult to every year you've lived and everything you know and everything you are. You are not worth a number that fits in a man's coat pocket." "And I should not have said it that way, but that's what I mean." Fannie Morgan stared at him. The August heat pressed down on them both. Somewhere down the street a horse stamped and a door banged shut. The square was nearly empty now. "Where is Double Creek Ranch?" she said finally. "South," he said. 12 miles. Good land. The owner's a fair man named McAllister. I have a bunkhouse and the hands have their own quarters. There's a cook's cabin that's been empty since our last cook left for New Mexico. It would be a proper place to stay, with a door that locks, and I would find you work that's honest and pays a real wage." He hesitated. "I know that's not what the contract says." "The contract says I own 3 years of your time. I'm telling you what I'm actually offering, which is something different." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're a strange man, Mr. Slater." "So I've been told," he said. She picked up her cloth bag. "I'll come," she said, "for now, until I figure out what I'm doing." "That's all I'm asking," he said. He put his hat back on. "My horse is down the street. It's a long walk in this heat if you'd rather I hired a wagon." "I can ride," she said with a note that made very clear she found the question slightly offensive. "Then we'll double up on Roan," Patrick said. "He's steady and he won't mind the weight." They walked side by side down the empty midday street of Redemption, and Patrick was very aware of the contrast they must make him with his canvas duster and his saddlebags, her with her faded blue dress and her cloth bag, and he was aware of the eyes he could feel following them from the windows of the Redemption Hotel and the barber shop, and the dry goods store, people watching and drawing their conclusions, and he decided he did not care about any of that at all. He helped her up onto roan, handed her the cloth bag, and then mounted behind her and turned the horse south. As they left the outskirts of Redemption behind and the open Texas grassland opened up ahead of them, shimmering with heat, he could feel the tension in her spine gradually, incrementally begin to release, the way a fist opens when the danger has passed, and he thought that was one of the bravest things he had ever seen. A person who had been holding themselves together under impossible pressure, finally, slowly, beginning to believe they might be allowed to breathe. She did not speak for the first mile, and he did not push her. The grassland rolled out in every direction, bleached gold and russet with late summer, and the sky above was the particular hard blue of a Texas August, utterly cloudless and overwhelming in its scale. Somewhere in the middle distance, a hawk was working a thermal in long, lazy circles. How did it happen? Patrick asked eventually, carefully, the way you approach a horse that has been badly treated slowly, without sudden movements, giving it every opportunity to refuse. If you want to tell it. She was quiet for another half-mile. Then she said, "My father died in March. He owed money to 3 men and a bank, and when he died there was nothing left. The farm had already been mortgaged and the land went to the bank, and the 3 men came to me for the rest of what they were owed. Coombe was one of them. He said the only way to settle the balance was the contract." She paused. "I signed it because the alternative was being charged with my father's debts in a court that would have gone against me, and then I would have had nothing and no legal protection at all. At least the contract had an end date." 3 years, Patrick said. 3 years, she agreed. Which feels like a long time when you're standing on a platform in the middle of August, and Bertram Sully is looking at you like you're a chair he's deciding whether to purchase. The bitterness in her voice was controlled and precise, not self-pitying but factual, and it told Patrick something about Fannie Morgan that he tucked away carefully. She was not a woman who wasted energy on things that could not be changed. She was someone who assessed the situation, identified the actual shape of it, and worked with what was real. He respected that profoundly, having spent most of his life trying to do the same thing. "You're from where?" he asked. "Arkansas originally," she said. "We came to Texas when I was 16. My father thought there was more land to be had here, which was true, but it didn't work out the way he planned." A small pause. "There's just me now. I had a brother, but he died of fever 2 winters ago." "I'm sorry," Patrick said, and meant it. "What about you?" she said, and the question had the slight stiffness of someone who found it easier to turn inquiry outward than to continue being its object. "I'm from Missouri," he said. "Came west with a cattle drive when I was 19 and never particularly found a reason to go back. My parents are both gone. I've got a sister in Kansas City I write to about twice a year." He thought about it. "That's about the whole of it. And you've been at Double Creek 7 years. Almost 8 now," he said. "McAllister is a good man. He works you hard, but he's fair about wages and he doesn't ask you to do anything that crosses the line." He paused. "That's harder to find than you might think." They rode in silence for a while after that. A silence that had changed in quality from the guarded quiet of the first mile to something marginally easier. The silence of 2 people who have exchanged enough information to have a rough map of each other and are still navigating what to do with it. The heat was relentless and the land was wide, and Patrick let roan set his own pace, which was the steady, unhurried walk of an experienced animal that knew his way home. When they came over the last long rise, and the Double Creek Ranch came into view below them, the main house with its wide porch, the bunkhouse and cookhouse, and the series of corrals and outbuildings that marked a working cattle operation, Patrick heard Fannie take a quiet breath beside him, and he understood it. The ranch was not grand by any standard, but it was solid and well-maintained, the kind of place that communicated immediately that it was run by people who took pride in what they did. And after however long Fannie Morgan had been on the road with everything she owned in a cloth bag, He imagined that something solid and well-maintained looked considerably better than anything she might have expected. Alton McAllister came out onto the porch as they rode in, a stocky man in his mid-50s with a thick gray beard and the deliberate movements of someone who had been managing cattle and people for 3 decades and had learned that most situations benefited from a lack of haste. He watched Patrick and Fannie ride in with the measured expression of a man who was reserving judgment until he had more information. Patrick dismounted and helped Fannie down, and then he went up to McAllister and explained the situation with complete honesty, which was the only way he had ever conducted any business with his employer. He told him about the auction and the contract in Bertram Sully and what he had done with $22. And as he talked, he watched McAllister's face move through several calculations at once. When Patrick had finished, McAllister looked past him at Fannie, who was standing a few feet away in the dust of the yard, holding her cloth bag with the composure of a person who was accustomed to having their fate discussed in their presence by people they had just met, and had learned to endure it without showing what it cost them. "Miss Morgan," McAllister said, and there was something in his voice that was different from the tone he had been using with Patrick, something more careful, more deliberate. "My name is Alton McAllister. This is my ranch. I understand you've had a considerable hardship brought down on you, and I want to say plainly that what was done to you in that square today is not something I hold with. A woman is not livestock." He glanced at Patrick with a look that said a great deal without saying any of it. "My foreman seems to have acquired your contract with the intention of giving you more options than that auction left you with. I don't know yet exactly what arrangement you'll want to make, but for tonight there's a cabin that's yours and a hot meal and a safe place to sleep, and tomorrow we can talk about what makes sense." Fannie looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Mr. McAllister," she said. "I appreciate plain speaking." "Good," McAllister said. "Then we'll get along fine." The cook's cabin was small but sound, a single room with a narrow bed, a stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out toward the creek that gave the ranch its name. Patrick showed her to it, found her clean towels and a pitcher of water and a spare bar of soap from the bunkhouse stores, and then stood in the doorway feeling unexpectedly uncertain about what to say. "I'll get your meals taken care of," he said. "And tomorrow we can talk about wages and what the work would actually look like. The contract says 3 years, but what I'm proposing is that you stay as long as you want to and leave when you don't." "What happens to the contract?" she said. "Nothing. It sits in a drawer and nobody enforces it," he said. "Or we take it to a proper lawyer in Austin and have it set aside if there's legal ground for that. I'll pay for the lawyer." She looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light was coming through the cabin window and catching the chestnut in her hair and the line of her jaw, and Patrick was aware, in a way he was not accustomed to being aware of things, of how tired she looked beneath the composure, not weak tired but deep tired, the tiredness of someone who has been fighting for a very long time. "You don't know me," she said. "You spent $22 and you're offering a lawyer on top of it, and you don't know anything about me." "I know what I saw," he said simply, "and I know what kind of man Sully is. Those 2 things were enough." She set her cloth bag down on the table. Something in her shoulders settled just slightly, like a weight redistributing. "Good night, Mr. Slater," she said. "Good night, Miss Morgan," he said, and went back to the bunkhouse to figure out how he was going to explain to his savings what had just happened to them. The weeks that followed were, in their own fashion, the most interesting weeks of Patrick Slater's life at Double Creek Ranch, though he would not have phrased it quite that way to anyone who asked. Fannie Morgan, it turned out, was a great deal more than a woman who had been sold in a town square. She knew cattle. She had grown up on a farm in Arkansas and had been working alongside her father since she was old enough to be useful. And while her background was in farming rather than ranching, the fundamental skills of animal management and hard physical work translated readily enough. She understood horses. She could manage basic veterinary care. She could mend tack and she could drive a wagon, and she had a fearless, practical intelligence that showed itself in everything she did. McAllister offered her a real position within the first week, not housekeeper, though she helped with the ranch house cooking sometimes by her own choice, but an actual ranch hand with actual wages. It was unusual, a woman working cattle alongside the men, and there were some among the hands who had opinions about it. But Fannie had a particular ability to make opinions of that variety feel very small and poorly founded without ever raising her voice. And within a month, she was simply part of the work at Double Creek the way everything else was, unremarkable in the best possible way. Patrick watched all of this from the careful distance of a man who was trying very hard to behave himself. He was her employer, technically. The contract was still technically in his name, whatever he had said about what it meant in practice. And he was not a man who believed in using the position of authority he held to make personal overtures to women who were in some sense dependent on his goodwill. It seemed wrong to him, a corruption of the thing he had done at the auction, which had been about giving her freedom, not about acquiring something for himself. But he was not made of stone. He noticed things. He noticed the way she sat a horse, completely at ease, and with a lightness that told you she had been riding since early childhood. He noticed the quality of her attention when she was listening to someone, the way she actually heard what they said rather than waiting for her turn to speak. He noticed the dry, precise way she could be funny when she was comfortable, a capacity that emerged gradually over the first weeks as she began to trust the people around her, appearing in small, bright moments like sunlight through moving leaves. He noticed that she was rebuilding herself, piece by piece, in the safety of the Double Creek Ranch, and that watching this happen was one of the most quietly extraordinary things he had ever seen. They began spending time together that was not strictly about the work, not by design exactly, but because the work kept putting them in the same places. Afternoon rides to check the south fence line. Evening hours on the porch of the main house when the day's work was done, and the cool of the evening was just beginning to lift the brutal heat. Conversations over coffee in the cookhouse that started about cattle and drifted gradually and naturally into the territory of the larger things. What people wanted from their lives, what they believed about the world, what had shaped them into the particular people they had become. One September evening, about 6 weeks after Fannie's arrival, they were sitting on the fence rail by the creek, watching the water catch the last of the sunset light, and Fannie said without preamble, "Can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" "Yes," Patrick said. "Why did you say it was an insult? That day in the square, you said $22 was an insult." Patrick thought about it. The creek moved past below them, dark and quiet, and somewhere downstream a night bird was beginning its calls into the thickening dusk. "Because it was," he said. "Any price is an insult. The whole situation was an insult. A number doesn't capture a person. It can't. And putting a number on you in that square, calling it $12, calling it 22, it doesn't matter what the number was, it was a reduction of something that can't be reduced." He paused. "I said it badly that day. I was angry and I said it in the wrong order." "No," she said. "You said it the right way. I understood what you meant." She was looking at the creek, not at him, and the fading light was making everything amber and rose, and the particular golden quality that belongs only to late summer evenings in the Texas Hill Country. And Patrick was aware with a clarity that was almost physical of how precisely this moment felt, how completely present he was in it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I want to tell you that I've been thinking about what you did, and I know how I initially received it as charity, or as the kind of thing that puts you in someone's debt in ways that aren't written in any contract, and I was suspicious of it for a while. I was looking for the thing it cost, looking for what you were going to want in exchange for it." "That's reasonable," Patrick said quietly, "given the circumstances." "Yes," she agreed. "It was reasonable. But it's been 6 weeks and I haven't found the cost. You haven't treated me as a debt or a possession or a charity case. You've treated me like a person who works here and deserves the same respect as anyone else." She turned to look at him then, and her dark eyes in the fading light had a directness that he found simultaneously very easy and very complicated to hold. I wanted to say thank you, properly, not for the $22 but for what the $22 actually was, which was you deciding I was worth the trouble of treating like a human being. You don't have to thank me for that, Patrick said. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to, there's a difference. He held her gaze and felt something shift between them, some change in the air that was like the way the barometric pressure drops before a storm, a sense of something gathering. Fannie, he said, and then stopped, because he was not sure exactly what he wanted to say next. Patrick, she said, in a tone that suggested she had the same problem. They both looked back at the creek and sat in a silence that was different from any of the previous silences, charged with something unnamed that neither of them was quite ready to name yet. And the night came on around them with its usual Texas thoroughness, bringing the stars out in their thousands, and the cool air off the grasslands and the smell of the creek, and the sound of cattle settling down for the night in the far pasture. And it was one of those moments that lodges in the memory and stays there forever, whole and unchanged. The trouble, when it came, arrived on a Wednesday morning in October in the form of Bertram Sully, who rode onto the Double Creek property with two men at his side, and an expression on his face that suggested he had been harboring a grievance since August and had decided to do something about it. Patrick was in the corral working with a young horse when Sully's party rode in, and he saw them from across the yard and felt the particular wariness that certain presences trigger in a person who has learned to pay attention to warning signs. He handed the lead rope to one of the hands, came through the fence, and went out to meet Sully in the yard. Slater, Sully said, looking down from his horse with the entitled ease of a man who spent a lot of time looking down at people from horses. I want a conversation about that woman. Miss Morgan works here, Patrick said. If you've got ranch business, I'm listening. That contract you bought, Sully said. I've spoken to Coombe and I've spoken to a legal man in town, and there is a question about whether you've been honoring the terms. The contract specifies the provision of labor and lodging as arranged by the contract holder, and my legal man says if you've been paying her like a regular hand, you may be in breach. This was, Patrick recognized immediately, not really a legal argument. It was a pressure tactic, the kind of thing a man does when he wants something and hasn't found a legitimate way to get it. Sully wanted Fannie, or he wanted the satisfaction of preventing Patrick from having her, or some mixture of the two, and he had dressed that desire up in contract language to give it a respectable appearance. Your legal man is welcome to look at the paperwork, Patrick said evenly. And then I'll have my own legal man look at it, and we'll see what comes of that. I'm prepared to buy the contract from you, Sully said. I'll pay you $30. That's a profit of $8 on what you spent. The contract's not for sale, Patrick said. Sully leaned forward on his saddle horn. I'd think carefully about that, he said. I have a certain amount of standing in this county and a certain amount of patience, and the patience is running shorter than the standing. Is that a threat? Patrick asked, in a tone that was completely calm and completely clear. The two men with Sully shifted slightly in their saddles. Sully held Patrick's gaze for a moment and then straightened up and pulled his horse around. I'm just having a conversation, he said. Think it over. He rode out of the yard and his men followed him, and Patrick watched them go until they were over the rise and gone. He stood in the yard for a moment and then went to find McAllister, and then he went to find Fannie. He told her straight. That was who he was. He did not manage information to protect people from unpleasant realities, because in his experience it always made things worse. He told her about Sully's visit and what had been said and what he thought it meant. Fannie listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance, and when he had finished she said, "He's not going to stop." "No," Patrick said, "I don't think he is. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to Austin," he said. "I'm going to find a proper lawyer and I'm going to get that contract set aside, legally and completely, so there's nothing for him to use. It'll take a week there and back. McAllister has agreed to look after things here while I'm gone." He paused. "You'll be safe here. McAllister won't let Sully on the property, and the Hands are good people." Fannie uncrossed her arms. Her expression was complicated in a way he could not entirely read, and then she said, "You're going to spend more money on a lawyer." "It's an investment," he said. "Patrick." She said his name in a way that carried some kind of weight he could feel without being able to measure. "You have spent a great deal of yourself on my behalf. The money in August. Now a week's ride and lawyer's fees. I want you to know that I'm aware of it." "I know you are," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. The October morning was mild and clear, the heat of summer finally broken, and the light was the warm amber of autumn rather than the hard white of August, and everything smelled of dry grass and turning leaves and the distant hint of wood smoke from the cookhouse. He looked at Fannie Morgan in that light and made a decision to stop being careful. "Because you matter to me," he said. "More than is probably appropriate to say to someone I've known for 6 weeks. But there it is. You matter to me, and I don't want you to spend another day of your life in a situation you didn't choose and can't leave. And beyond all of that, I would very much like, if you're willing, to begin figuring out whether what I feel is something you feel too, and I can't do that properly while Sully is hanging over everything like a cloud." Fannie looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a decisiveness that was entirely characteristic of her, she said, "It is." "Is what?" he said, not trusting himself to interpret correctly. "Something I feel too," she said. "Has been for a while. I just wasn't ready to say it until I knew what the ground felt like under my feet." "And now," he said. "Go to Austin," she said. "Come back, we'll talk more then." But she was smiling as she said it, a real smile, not the ghost of one but the full thing, and it transformed her face in a way that did something to Patrick's chest that he decided not to examine too carefully until he was on his horse and heading northeast toward Austin. He rode to Austin in 4 days, found a lawyer named Caldwell who came highly recommended by a man McAllister knew in the capital, and laid the whole situation out for him. Caldwell was a sharp, bespectacled man in his 40s who listened with the concentrated patience of someone who has heard a great many stories of human difficulty and has learned that the details always matter. When Patrick had finished, Caldwell said, "The contract has several problems from a legal standpoint. The principal one is that it was signed under financial duress by a party who had no independent legal representation and was facing an immediate threat, which is to say, a threatened lawsuit over debts that may not have been hers to begin with." He tapped his pen on his desk. "Moreover, the terms of the contract, as you've described them, are vague enough to be unenforceable in several key respects. I believe we can have this set aside, though it will take some correspondence and some time." "How much time?" Patrick said. "A month, possibly 2, Caldwell said. "And there's the question of the original debts. If we set aside the contract, the question of what was owed by her father's estate remains open." "What would it take to settle those debts outright?" Patrick said. Caldwell looked at him over his spectacles with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained, Patrick thought, a small amount of respect. "I would need to see the debt instruments and verify the amounts," he said. "But based on what you've described, we might be talking about $40 to $60 in total." Patrick thought about his savings. He had been careful with money for 8 years, living simply on the ranch, and he had a sum put by that he had been vaguely planning to use someday for land of his own. It was not a grand sum, but it was real and it was there. He thought about Fannie's face when she smiled. He thought about the bruise that had been on her cheekbone in August, now long healed, and what it represented about how the world had treated her before August. He thought about 3 years of a woman's life reduced to a number in a square. "Find out the amounts," he said. "I want to settle them entirely. I want there to be nothing anyone can hold over her head, nothing at all." Caldwell nodded slowly. "You understand," he said carefully, "that Miss Morgan is not your responsibility." "No," Patrick said. "She's not, I know that, but she's important to me. And clearing this completely is what I want to do if it can be done." He spent 3 days in Austin while Caldwell made inquiries, identified the 3 debt holders, and began the process of negotiating settlements. One of the men was easy. He accepted a straightforward payment and signed a release without fuss. The second required 2 meetings before he was satisfied. The third, who turned out to be Coombe himself, was the most difficult, complaining that he was owed not just the face value of the debt, but the profit he would have made on 3 years of Fannie's labor, which was not a legally sound argument but required Caldwell's patient demolition before Coombe would sign anything. When it was all done, Patrick had spent $54 settling Fannie Morgan's father's debts, on top of the $22 at the auction and Caldwell's fees of $15. He rode back to Double Creek Ranch in early November with a folder of signed releases and the set-aside motion for the contract, and exactly $11 to his name, and he was not unhappy about any of it. He came into the yard in the late afternoon of the 5th day of his return ride, tired and dusty from the road, and Fannie was there. She had apparently seen him coming over the last rise, because she was already out of the cook's cabin and walking across the yard toward him, and the look on her face was one he would keep in his memory for the rest of his life. "Well," she said, when he had dismounted and they were standing face to face in the autumn light. He handed her the folder of papers. She opened it and read through them, and he watched her face as she did, the careful, controlled expression giving way by degrees to something raw and wondering, something that looked like the moment when you stop bracing for a blow that doesn't come. She closed the folder. She looked at him. "All of it," she said. "All of it," he said. "You have no debts. The contract is set aside. There's nothing." Fannie Morgan pressed the folder against her chest and closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again there were tears on her face, which seemed to surprise her. She touched her cheek with one hand as if she had not known they were coming. She was not a woman who cried easily, he had learned, and these were not the tears of sentimentality but of something larger and more fundamental, the way a person cries when a very long siege is finally over. "Patrick," she said. "Yes," he said. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the middle of the yard of the Double Creek Ranch in the November afternoon, with the folder of papers between them and the sounds of the working ranch all around them, and the smell of horses and dry grass, and the first hint of the coming winter in the air. And it was the simplest and the most complete thing Patrick Slater had felt in his entire life. She pulled back after a moment and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and there was a beat of the kind of silence that says everything without words, and then he said, "I'd like to court you properly, if that's agreeable to you." "It's very agreeable," she said, and that smile came back, the real one, the full one, and he thought it was the best thing he had ever seen in his 28. He was 28 years of living. The winter at Double Creek Ranch was the kind of winter that West Texas occasionally delivered, when it wanted to demonstrate that it had not entirely abandoned the capacity for cold. Not the brutal winters of the northern plains, but biting enough, with frost in the mornings and the occasional hard wind that came screaming down from the north and made everyone grateful for solid buildings and stacked firewood. Patrick and Fannie spent that winter, in all the ways that the work of the ranch allowed, becoming gradually, thoroughly acquainted with each other. Not in the frantic, electric way of people who have too little time and are aware of it, but in the steady, cumulative way of people who are building something they intend to last. Long conversations in the evenings, sometimes at the main house with McAllister and his wife Clara, sometimes alone by the stove in the cookhouse over the last of the day's coffee. Rides across the winter range when the weather allowed. Arguments occasionally, because Fannie was not a woman who softened her opinions to make other people comfortable, and Patrick was not a man who changed his positions without good reason. And when two people like that disagree, there is genuine friction, but it was the kind of friction that generates heat rather than damage, the kind that clarifies rather than obscures. He learned that she had been formally educated beyond what was typical for women in her circumstances. Her mother, who had died when Fannie was 12, had been a school teacher and had instilled in her daughter a love of reading, and a respect for precise thought that Fannie carried like a quiet private inheritance. She had a small collection of books in the cook's cabin, well worn, that she had somehow preserved through everything. A Bible, a copy of Jane Eyre that had lost its cover somewhere along the way, and a practical manual on animal husbandry that she consulted with the same gravity she gave the other two. He learned that she made her decisions with a thoroughness that looked like slowness, until you understood that she was simply being completely certain before she committed, and that once she committed to something she was entirely committed, without reservation or second-guessing. He saw this in the way she worked, and the way she managed the horses, and the way she navigated her relationships with the other hands on the ranch, and he recognized it as something he had not known he was looking for until he found it, a kind of integrity that went all the way through. She learned things about him, too. She learned that he was a man who showed his feelings more through action than through speech. He was not cold or withholding, but he expressed things by doing them rather than describing them, and once she understood that vocabulary, she could read him clearly. She learned that he had a dry humor that emerged mostly when he was relaxed, and that his sense of what was funny was almost always the same as hers, which she considered a significant compatibility. She learned that he was genuinely, thoughtfully kind in ways that were not performative, not kind because he wanted people to notice, but kind because it was how he understood a person was supposed to move through the world. She learned that she trusted him. This was the most significant discovery, and it took the longest to arrive at completely, because trust is not a decision so much as an accumulation of evidence, and she had reason from recent experience to be careful about accumulating evidence before she committed to conclusions. But by the deep of the winter, sitting across from him in the cookhouse with the wind outside and the stove warm between them, she found that she had arrived at it without noticing the specific moment it happened, which was, she thought, how the real ones always worked. In January, Patrick asked McAllister about the possibility of a small piece of land. He had been thinking about this for a while, turning it over with the methodical care he gave to any large decision, and he had reached a point where the thinking had resolved into something clear. McAllister owned a section of land on the eastern boundary of Double Creek that he had been holding for expansion, but had decided he was not going to develop. It was good land, with its own water source, a modest natural rise that would make a fine building site, and enough acreage for a small operation. He had been thinking about selling it. They had a long conversation in McAllister's study, just the two of them, and at the end of it, McAllister offered Patrick first consideration on the land, at a price that reflected the fact that he valued his foreman and understood what was happening, and was not entirely indifferent to the idea of keeping good people close. Patrick went back to his room in the bunkhouse and did the arithmetic very carefully. With what he had left after Austin and what he had saved through the fall and winter, he was short of what McAllister was asking. Not by a great deal, but by enough to matter. He thought about it for 3 days and then he went and talked to Fannie. He told her about the land. He told her what McAllister was asking and where his own savings stood and what the shortfall was. And then he said, "I'm not asking you to solve the problem. I'm telling you because it's a situation that concerns both of us and I don't think decisions about both of us should be made by one of us." Fannie was quiet for a moment. "What are you saying?" she said. "Say it plainly." He took a breath. "I'm saying that I love you," he said. "I'm saying I want to marry you if you'll have me. And I'm saying that the land would be ours together, and the savings I'm short of. You've been earning wages here for 4 months, and if you were willing to put that toward the land, it would be a partnership in every way from the beginning." He paused. "But I want to be clear that the proposal and the land are 2 separate things. I'm not asking you to marry me because of the money. I'm asking you to marry me because I want to spend the rest of my life being in the same place you are, and that feeling is not going to change whether we have land or not." Fannie looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "How much are you short?" $15, he said. I have 22 saved, she said. Since August, he blinked. You've been here since August and you have $22 saved already. I've been spending very little, she said. I didn't know what I was saving for, now I do. The silence that followed was the quiet of two people who have just seen the shape of something they want and found it is possible. Then Fannie said, yes. Yes, he said. Yes to the proposal, she said. And yes to the land and yes to the partnership, all of it. He crossed the cookhouse in 2 steps and took her face in both hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his size and the roughness of his hands, and kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that has the weight of everything that preceded it. Every conversation and every evening by the creek, and every mile of riding, and every document signed in Austin, and every moment of choosing to be decent when the world offered easier options. And it tasted like the beginning of something that would last. They were married in March of 1879, when the Texas spring was beginning to turn the grassland green, and the wildflowers were coming up along the creek banks in the pale yellows and blues and pinks that belonged to that particular season. McAllister's wife, Clara, who had a warmth and an organizational capacity that made her invaluable in any situation requiring both, managed the preparations with the cheerful authority of a woman who had wanted this to happen since about October, and was very pleased that everyone had finally caught up with her. The ceremony was simple, held on the wide porch of the main house with the ranch hands as witnesses, and a traveling minister named Brooke who came through redemption twice a year, and who had a kind, direct manner that suited both Patrick and Fannie better than the more theatrical alternatives would have. They said their vows in the morning light with the spring air around them and the sound of the creek in the background, and when Brooke pronounced them married and Patrick kissed his wife in front of the assembled company of the Double Creek Ranch, there was a cheer that sent the barn cats scattering to the fences and brought a smile to Fannie's face that Patrick would spend the rest of his life considering one of the finest sights in the available universe. They moved into the cook's cabin together, while the house on their land was being built. The building project was a collective affair. McAllister gave Patrick time off his regular duties to work on it, and several of the hands pitched in on their days off with the easy generosity of people who like their foreman and his new wife and want to see them settled. The house went up through the spring and early summer, a proper house with 2 rooms and a loft and a real stone fireplace, and a porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, and had a view of the stretch of grassland running down to the water. They moved in on a July evening, carrying their combined belongings in 2 trips from the cook's cabin, and stood together on the new porch in the summer dusk and looked out at the land that was theirs and said nothing for a while because nothing needed to be said. "We should name it," Fannie said eventually. "The ranch, the place," she said. "Whatever we're going to call it." Patrick thought about it. He thought about August in a town square and a woman with a cloth bag and everything that had come after. "Morning Creek," he said, "for the view of the water from the porch." Fannie leaned against him. "Morning Creek," she agreed. "That's right." They worked the land through that first summer and fall with the shared intensity of 2 people who know exactly what they're building and why, and are not inclined to approach it halfway. They ran a small herd initially, buying cattle with careful judgment and building slowly, and Patrick continued his work for McAllister as foreman through the transition, the 2 operations existing in companionable proximity on neighboring acres. Fannie managed the Morning Creek operation with the same precise intelligence she brought to everything, her father's Arkansas farming background combining with 4 years of Texas ranching experience to produce someone who could make good decisions about land and stock and resources. It was not easy. The first year had a dry summer that hit the grass hard and required some difficult choices about the herd size. There was a fence dispute with a neighbor to the north that required careful, patient management before it resolved. There were months when the accounts were tight enough that they ate simply and spent nothing they did not have to, and went asleep tired and woke up to do it all again. But there was also this. The evenings on the east porch with the grassland gold in the late light, and a cup of coffee between them and the sound of the cattle settled for the night. The mornings when the light came up over the creek and turned everything luminous, and Fannie was still asleep, and the world was quiet, and Patrick would stand at the bedroom window and feel a gratitude so complete it had no adequate language. The middle of the night laughter when something went wrong in a way that was terrible and funny simultaneously, which was most of the ways things went wrong on a working ranch. The particular piece of lying next to someone you trust completely, in a house you built with your own hands, on land that is yours. And there was the October morning in 1879, a year and a few months after that August afternoon in the square, when Fannie came out to the corral where Patrick was working and stood at the fence rail and waited until he noticed her. And when he came over, she told him she was going to have a child. He looked at her face as she said it. She had the contained expression she still sometimes wore when she was not sure how something would be received, the old wariness that had mostly but not entirely faded, and he reached over the fence rail and took both her hands in his and said, "Fannie, that is the finest thing you have ever told me, and that is saying something very significant." She laughed, a real laugh, and the wariness left her face entirely. The winter of 1879 was spent in the warmth of the Morning Creek house, preparing with the combination of practical care and barely suppressed delight that characterizes people who are waiting for something very good. Clara McAllister, who had raised 3 children of her own, was a constant and invaluable presence, full of the specific knowledge of someone who had navigated this territory before and knew where all the difficult passages were. Patrick developed a habit of doing the chores that required heavy lifting or climbing before Fannie could get to them, which she found both touching and occasionally exasperating, and told him so directly, which led to a conversation about the difference between caution and condescension that they settled satisfactorily over dinner. Thomas Patrick Slater came into the world on a late February morning in 1880, when the last of the winter was still in the air, but the first tentative green was showing along the creek banks, delivered with Clara McAllister's competent assistance, and the presence of a doctor named Hartley who had recently established a practice in redemption, and rode out to the ranch without complaint at an early hour. He was a healthy, loud, entirely determined child who arrived with a full set of opinions about his circumstances and communicated them clearly to anyone within range. Patrick held his son for the first time and felt something enormous and simple move through him, the way a great river runs deep and steady and without visible bottom. He looked up at Fannie, who was exhausted and clear-eyed and watching him with an expression of great transparency, and he said, "Hello, Thomas." "He's going to be trouble," Fannie said, with the certainty of a woman who has already been observing his character for several hours. "He has good parents," Patrick said. She smiled. "Yes," she said, "he does." The spring of 1880 brought the Morning Creek Ranch into a new season of its life. The second year of operation saw better rains and better grass, and a calf crop that exceeded what Patrick and Fannie had projected, and by midsummer, they were in a position to expand the herd modestly and to make some of the improvements to the property they had been postponing. A second corral, a proper barn with a hay loft, a chicken house that Fannie built herself over 3 weekends with Thomas in a cradle board on her back in a manner that made Patrick both worried and deeply impressed. Thomas, as predicted, was energetically opinionated from his first months, a child who approached every new experience with the combined curiosity of both his parents and the fearlessness of someone who had not yet learned what things could hurt you. He was walking by 11 months and talking in fragments by 14 months, and combining the two activities into a constant mobile commentary on the world by the time he was a year and a half old, which made the Morning Creek house extremely lively and rarely quiet. Patrick brought him to the corral in the early mornings and held him on the fence rail to see the horses, which Thomas greeted with a fervor that suggested he would be riding before he was 3, and Fannie began teaching him his letters before he was 2, with the patience of someone who had been taught well herself and understood what a gift it was. In the fall of 1880, on a clear October afternoon that smelled of dry grass and early wood smoke, Bertram Sully came to Morning Creek for the last time. He came alone, which was different from October of the previous year, and his manner was different too, less aggressive, carrying instead the quality of a man who has something on his mind that he has been carrying for a while and has finally decided to put down. He came to the porch and Patrick came out to meet him, and they stood looking at each other across the porch railing in the autumn light. "I'm not here for trouble," Sully said, which was not how their previous interactions had gone, and Patrick reserved judgment and said nothing and waited. Sully was quiet for a moment, looking out at the Morning Creek land, at the solid new barn and the well-fenced corrals and the smoke coming from the chimney of the house. Then he said, "I owe your wife an apology." Patrick held the silence. "I was wrong in what I did," Sully said. "In August of last year, I don't know if that matters to her or to you, but it's been on my mind." He looked down at his hands briefly. "I had a sister who was treated poorly by the world. She died some years ago. I thought I'd put the memory of it far enough back that it didn't affect my own conduct. I was wrong about that too." "I'll tell Fannie you came," Patrick said. "What she does with that is up to her." Sully nodded. He looked out at the land again. "You built a good thing here," he said, "and there was something genuine in it, something stripped of the old proprietary hostility. It's a fine piece of country." "It is," Patrick said. Sully put his hat back on and rode away, and Patrick stood on the porch and watched him go and thought about the ways people sometimes surprised you. Then he went back inside to where Thomas was pulling himself up against the leg of the kitchen table with great determination, and Fannie was at the stove, and the smell of the evening meal was filling the warm small house, and he told her what Sully had said, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "That must have cost him something," and went back to what she was doing. And that was that. The years settled in around the Morning Creek ranch with the gradual richness of a life that is being well lived. 1881 brought a second child, a daughter this time, born in May when the bluebonnets were thick along the creek banks, whom they named Clara in honor of the woman who had helped bring both their children into the world and who was one of the fixed stars of their lives. Clara McAllister cried when she was told, which was the only time Fannie had ever seen her do so, and then told Fannie she should not have done that, and then hugged her with great energy, and the whole sequence was very characteristic of her. Patrick expanded the Morning Creek herd through 1881 and 1882, making careful purchases and negotiating contracts with a trail boss named Ordega who ran cattle north to the railheads in Kansas, and who proved to be a reliable and honest business partner. The ranch grew in the steady, incremental way of things that are being built right rather than fast, and by 1882 Morning Creek was a recognized and respected operation in the county, known for the quality of its stock and the reliability of its owners. Alton McAllister retired from the active management of Double Creek in 1882 and handed the operation to his eldest son, a capable young man named Daniel who had been raised in the business and knew it well. Patrick remained as foreman through the transition, but the arrangement between Morning Creek and Double Creek had evolved naturally into something more like a partnership between neighboring ranches than an employer-employee relationship, which suited everyone involved. The town of Redemption changed too over those years, as small Texas towns did in the post-Trail Drive era, growing up slowly from the rough-edged settlement it had been in 1878 towards something with a little more solidity. A school that opened in 1881, a doctor's office that became permanent rather than occasional, a second church. The square where the auction platform had stood was now occupied by a community well and a public bench donated by the Redemption Improvement Society, and if you did not know what had happened there in August of 1878, you would not have known to look for a trace of it. Fannie knew. She walked through that square regularly enough, on errands and on the occasions the Slaters came to town for one reason or another, and she was not a person who flinched from her own history or pretended it had not happened. She thought about it, sometimes thought about the woman who had stood on that platform with a cloth bag at her feet and a bruise on her cheekbone, and the careful, deliberate refusal to let anyone see how afraid she was. And she thought about what had happened after, and found that the after was large enough and full enough that the fear and the indignity of that day had not been erased, but had been, perhaps, given a proper context. She had said something to that effect once to Patrick, lying in bed in the dark of the Morning Creek house with the children asleep in the next room, and the Texas night enormous and full of stars outside the window, and he had listened to the whole of it in his particular way of listening, fully present, without interruption, with the quality of attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him. And when she was done, he had said, "The platform was not the whole story. It was just the beginning of it." "Yes," she had said, "exactly." By the spring of 1883, Fannie was managing a small lending library out of the corner of her kitchen, the collection of books having grown over the years through purchases and gifts, and the occasional donation from people who wanted them to go to someone who would use them. She had, entirely without planning to, become the person in the Morning Creek vicinity who taught reading to the children of the families who could not access the town school, ranch families, homesteading families, families that were a long ride from redemption, and whose children would otherwise have grown up without letters. It began with 2 children and expanded to 8 within a year, and Fannie ran these lessons on Saturday mornings with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. Thomas was 3 years old and fully convinced of his own importance, which was not entirely inaccurate given the regard in which he was held by every adult on the property. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and an extremely personal relationship with every horse on the ranch, with Roan, now an elderly but still dignified animal enjoying an honored semi-retirement, occupying a particular place in his affections. He had also developed, at 3, a strong interest in the library corner of the kitchen, which meant that Fannie spent a notable amount of time redirecting him away from the lending copies before he could investigate them with the complete physical commitment of a 3-year-old. Clara, who was nearly 2, had a personality of great tranquility and steadiness that was quite different from her brother's and seemed, Patrick said with great affection, to have arrived with her own weather system calm, warm, with occasional strong views about particular foods. She was devoted to Fannie in the way of very small children who have found their center of gravity and are not inclined to move far from it, and spent a great deal of time in the kitchen with her, watching the proceedings with the alert interest of someone who is taking careful notes. The thing that Patrick thought about most, on the evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, and he and Fannie sat on the east porch with the grassland spread out before them, and the creek sound in the background, and the stars coming up one by one in the Texas sky, was the distance from that August afternoon in the square to this place. Not the physical distance, which was only 12 miles, but the other kind, the distance between Fannie standing on a platform with everything she owned in a cloth bag, while a man with a gavel put a number on 3 years of her life, and Fannie sitting beside him on their own porch on their own land with her coffee and her dry, clear intelligence, and her children sleeping in the house behind them. He thought about that distance sometimes with something close to vertigo, aware of how many choices had been involved. The choice he had made to turn that particular corner in redemption and see what the crowd was gathered for, the choice to bid, the choice to say what he had said about the price being an insult, the choice to ride to Austin, the choice to tell her plainly what he felt. Each choice had seemed at the time like the only thing a person of basic decency could do in that situation, which was, he had come to understand, not actually true. He had watched other people in that square that day do nothing, and he had met enough people in his life to know that basic decency was not, in fact, universal. The choices had been real choices. He was glad he had made them. He would make them all again without hesitation. And then he would look at Fannie in the evening light and think that the sum of all those choices had produced this. This porch, this land, this woman beside him, the sound of their children breathing in the house behind them, and the word gladness seemed too small for it. It was on one of these evenings in the late summer of 1883 that Fannie said without preamble, in the way she had of saying the most significant things as if they were simply the next item in the natural order of conversation, "I've been thinking about the school." "The Saturday school," he said. "No, a proper one," she said. "The families out here are too far from redemption, and Daniel McAllister told me his wife has been saying the same thing. There are enough children between our operation and his and the 3 Homestead families to the east that it would justify a schoolroom. Not grand, just a room." She paused. "I want to teach them properly. I want them to have what my mother gave me." "Then we'll build a room," Patrick said. "By spring." She looked at him, just like that. "You want a schoolroom," he said. "We have lumber and we have hands. That's a schoolroom." Fannie was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are a very good man, Patrick Slater." "I have a great deal of inspiration," he said. She laughed and leaned against him, and they sat in the quiet of the evening and listened to the creek and the cattle and the vast, ancient quiet of the Texas night. And somewhere in the middle of the darkness, a coyote sang its particular song to the sky and was answered from far away. And the world was large and old and entirely indifferent. But on the porch of the Morning Creek Ranch, 2 people sat together and were entirely, completely, fundamentally at home. The schoolroom went up the following spring, as promised, built onto the east side of the barn with 3 windows and 6 benches, and a blackboard that Patrick hauled from Redemption in the wagon, with the solemnity of a man transporting something of real value. The first proper class day in April of 1884 had 11 children ranging from age 4 to 12, from 4 different families, and Fannie stood at the front of the room in the morning light and looked at them. Their faces turned toward her with the particular alertness of children who know they are about to be given something, and felt something so full and uncomplicated that it required no further examination. Thomas was 4 and old enough for the youngest group, and attended his mother's school with a combination of enthusiasm for the alphabet and periodic attempts to discuss horses when the topic had moved on to other subjects, which Fannie managed with the practiced authority of a woman who was simultaneously his teacher and his mother, and was clear-eyed about both roles. The years built themselves one on another the way years do when the life inside them is rich, each one distinct in its particulars, in its seasons and its difficulties and its joys, but forming together into a continuity that had texture and weight, and the irreplaceable quality of things that are real. The Morning Creek herd grew steadily. The library corner in the kitchen expanded to a dedicated shelf, and then to 2 shelves. The school had 16 children by 1885. Patrick hired 2 additional hands, and Fannie managed the accounts for both the ranch and the school with the organized precision that made her, McAllister once said, better at the numbers side of things than most men he knew with 10 more years of experience. In the spring of 1886, their 3rd child was born, another son, whom they named James after Fannie's father, which was a decision that had taken her some time to arrive at, and which she explained to Patrick one night simply by saying, "He was my father. He made bad decisions, but he loved me, and I want James to have his name." Patrick had said nothing and simply held her hand, and that was the right response. James was a cheerful, round-faced child with Fannie's dark eyes and Patrick's temperament, deliberate, observant, slow to speak and thorough when he did. And he arrived into a household that had learned, over 6 years of operation, how to absorb new people and make room for them without losing its equilibrium. Thomas was 6 by then, all energy and conviction, and a particular attachment to the horses that had already gone beyond affection into something that looked like a genuine vocation. Clara was 4 and had developed, under the influence of the school, a passion for drawing that covered every available surface with small, precise images of the world around her. Patrick looked at his 3 children sometimes with a feeling he could not name in any single word, something that encompassed the past and the present simultaneously, that held within it the memory of the boy who had ridden west from Missouri at 19, with nothing much to his name, and no idea what he was going to find, and the man who stood now on the porch of the house he had built on the land that was his with his wife and his children and his life, enormous and particular and completely real. He told Fannie this one evening, or tried to make an attempt at putting it into words, which was not his strongest skill and which she understood he was doing her the honor of attempting. She listened to the whole imperfect, sincere attempt and then said, "You came around a corner in Redemption one afternoon and changed everything." "We both did," he said. "You were standing on a platform in August and you decided to hold your head up, and that changed everything too. That's where it started." She thought about it. "Yes," she said, "that's right." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so angry that day. I was so angry I thought it was going to come out of me sideways. At Coombe, at the crowd, at everyone standing there watching, I kept thinking there is not a person in this square who is going to do anything about this. And then," he said, "and then a man in the back said $15, she said, in a voice that sounded like he meant it. I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "I knew it then. I could hear the difference." She looked at him with those dark eyes that he had spent 8 years learning to read and never quite finished. "I am very glad you came around that corner. I am glad I came around that corner," he said, "every single day." The Morning Creek Ranch stood on its piece of Texas earth through the late 1880s and grew into itself the way good things do, not with the explosive speed of luck, but with the solid, incremental permanence of things that are built on honest foundations. By 1888, they ran a herd that Patrick had carefully built and managed over a decade, had a full operation with 3 hands and a bunkhouse of their own, and had paid off the land entirely from the ranch's own earnings. The school had grown into something recognized by the Redemption County Board of Education, and Fannie received a modest official salary for it, which she found satisfying not for the amount but for the acknowledgement, for the recognition that what she was doing was real and valuable, and counted in the official ledger of things that mattered. Thomas was 8 and already spending more time with the horses than he spent at his desk, which was a source of gentle, ongoing negotiation between him and his mother, who had firm views about the letters and numbers being as important as the saddle work, and Patrick, who agreed with Fannie completely, and also, when no one was looking, took his son to the corral and let him work with the young horses in the evenings because the boy had a genuine gift, and it seemed wrong not to let it breathe. Clara was 6 and had covered 3 notebooks with her drawings, precise small images that captured the ranch and its people and animals and landscape with an accuracy that was remarkable for her age. She had also decided, with the certainty of a 6-year-old who knows her own mind, that she intended to teach school alongside her mother when she was old enough, which Fannie received with a happiness she was careful not to make too large, knowing that children's intentions changed, but which sat warmly in her nevertheless. James was 2 and moving through the world with the steady, observant quality that seemed to be the constant of his character, watchful, thorough, missing nothing, saying less than you would expect and understanding more. And so the family continued on the Morning Creek Ranch, through the seasons and the years, through the good years when the rain came and the grass was thick and the calves were strong, and the harder years when the drought came and required everything. They had to hold the herd together and the land in shape, through illness and recovery, and the small emergencies and medium emergencies that are the regular texture of life on a working ranch. There was the summer when a fence fire burned 30 acres of south pasture, and the whole neighborhood came to help contain it before it reached the structures. A day of smoke and hard work and controlled fear that ended with the Morning Creek Hands and the Double Creek Hands and two homesteading families all sitting exhausted on the ground by the creek, covered in ash, sharing whatever food and water had been brought. And Patrick and Fannie looking at each other across the gathered company, with a shared awareness that this was what community actually was, not a pleasant abstraction but people showing up when things were on fire. There was the winter when Thomas, at 10, fell from a horse and broke his arm and spent 3 weeks in plaster that he found approximately as confining as a prison sentence. And Patrick sat with him through the first bad nights when the pain was worst, and told him stories about his own early years on cattle drives that he had never told anyone before. Stories that Thomas listened to with a focus that was uncharacteristic of his normally restless attention, and that became, over the years, part of the family's private mythology. There was the spring when the Redemption School Board sent a representative to inspect the Morning Creek School, and found it not only satisfactory, but significantly better than several of the established town schools in the county, a finding that reached Fannie in the form of an official letter that she read twice, and then folded very carefully and put in the box where she kept the papers that mattered. There was the summer afternoon in 1889 when Patrick was mending the north fence and heard a sound from the direction of the creek and found Clara, who was 7, sitting on the bank with her notebook making a drawing of a great blue heron that had landed on the opposite bank. And he sat down beside her without speaking and watched the heron for a while, and Clara said without looking up, "It's a good one, isn't it, Papa?" meaning the heron, and he said, "It's a very good one." And they sat there together in the afternoon quiet, until the heron decided it had matters to attend to elsewhere and lifted off with a great slow beating of wings. And it was one of those moments that belongs entirely to itself and resists being converted into any larger significance, but sits in the memory, complete and irreducible. In the fall of 1890, 12 years after the auction in the square at Redemption, Patrick and Fannie sat on the east porch on a Sunday afternoon, while the children played in the yard. Thomas at 10, all authority and competence with the horses, Clara at 8 with her notebook, James at 4 making a careful investigation of a beetle he had found near the porch steps. And the Texas afternoon was mild, and the light was the long golden light of a September Sunday, and the creek sound came up from below, and the smell of the grassland was in everything. Fannie had a cup of tea and Patrick had coffee, and they sat in the particular way of people who have been sitting together in the same spot for many years and have long since passed beyond the need to fill the quiet with words, though the words were there when they wanted them, always had been. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Fannie said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the cloth bag," she said, "the one I had in the square. It had my mother's Bible in it and 2 changes of clothes and a photograph of my parents on their wedding day and about 50 cents in coin and a piece of ribbon I'd kept because it was my mother's and I couldn't explain why." She paused. "That was the whole of what I had in the world, and I stood there on that platform and I thought, this is everything. This cloth bag is everything." Patrick said nothing. He was listening. "And now," she said, looking out at the yard where her children played in the September light, at the house behind them and the barn and the corrals and the school building and the land running out to the horizon in every direction, at the life they had made with patience and honesty and the decision to turn toward rather than away from each other. "And now I could not put everything I have in any number of bags. There isn't a bag that size." "No," he said, "there isn't." She looked at him then with those dark eyes that had looked at him for 12 years, and that he still found the most interesting sight in the available world. "I love you, Patrick Slater," she said, not with the intensity of a new declaration but with the weight of 12 years of accumulated evidence, of every morning and every evening and every hard winter and every good spring and every argument and every conversation and every child and every acre and every decision made together, which gave those 4 words a density that the dictionary version of them did not contain. "I love you, Fannie Slater," he said, and put his hand over hers where it lay on the arm of her chair, and the September afternoon went on around them, warm and slow and completely, finally, permanently theirs. Thomas looked up from where he was working with a young horse near the corral fence and saw his parents on the porch, and said something to Clara that made her look up from her notebook and smile. And James found that the beetle had gone about its business elsewhere, and toddled up the porch steps to climb into his mother's lap. And Fanny received him with the automatic, complete ease of a woman who had been doing this for 10 years, and found it the least difficult and most important thing she did. And Patrick watched all of it with the full attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, and was not inclined to take any of it for granted. The creek ran below. The cattle grazed in the afternoon quiet. The grassland went out to the horizon under the wide Texas sky. The Morning Creek Ranch stood on its piece of earth, solid and real and whole, the way things are when they are built by the right people for the right reasons and given the time to become what they were always meant to be. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.